So, welcome everybody to our talk, Restricting the Scripts, You're to Blame, You Give CSP a Bad Name. This is a talk that I, Ben Stock, will be presenting together with my PhD student, Sebastian Roth. Sebastian, say hi to the audience.
Hey.
All right, so this talk, as you might have mentioned or might have guessed, is about CSP. So you could wonder now, what are two academics that are working at CSP doing at a conference like RuhrSec, which primarily is for, well, non-academics and people that like to break stuff. So we have to be honest, this is part of a research project that we have been running at CSP, essentially until, well, the end of last year. And so we conducted a scientific study about CSP deployment in the top 10,000 websites over a period between 2012 and 2018. And as you all might know, if you have heard about CSP before, well, CSP usage isn't really that widespread. Okay, and now we could essentially end the talk here, tell you something that you had known before, and then be done with it. However, we wanted to actually come here to share our insights because we feel that typically this audience that would be in front of us would actually have had their own issues with CSP maybe and could share some war stories. Unfortunately, you have to send us these via email, but we're very happy to take any feedback from you about the talk. And as well, we have to sit at home with our fake virtual backgrounds instead of going to the nice city of Bochum. We will do the talk in this way. All right, so as I said before, CSP is not really widely used. This is not something that we documented for the first time, but rather this was known for a while already. So our question, however, was how can we maybe improve the status quo in terms of CSP? And so again, when we built these slides, we were obviously hoping to do this talk with some interaction. And so we wanted to get to know the audience. Fortunately, we did a very similar talk at OWASP Amsterdam last year. So essentially, I can now ask this question and then give you feedback on how many people I think would have raised their hand. So first off, our question was, who has heard of CSP before? And essentially, I think most everybody would have heard about CSP as a mechanism maybe to well, stop cross-site scripting or mitigate cross-site scripting at least. We then asked people who has tried using CSP for their site before. And here there was also a lot of people that raised their hand. Obviously, these are all very security well, interested people that have tried to experiment with this to secure the web applications, at some point at least. We then asked who ran into functionality issue with CSP. And I would say out of those people that said we had tried using CSP at some point, about 90% again raised their hand saying, yes, we ran into some functionality issues with CSP at some point in the development. And then last but not least, I asked who thinks they are running a secure CSP with respect to content restriction? And that is without even saying what I think a secure CSP looks like. And unfortunately, in this entire room of about 100 people that were in front of us at OWASP, I think there was one person who raised their hand, claiming that he believed his company did in fact have a secure CSP. So this is obviously a problem, right? And we want to understand exactly why is this so problematic? And can we maybe identify trends in the evolution of CSP? But before we talk about CSP, I briefly want to kind of recapitulate why CSP was initially developed and what it's supposed to prevent, or at least mitigate. And in particular, these are so-called cross-site scripting attacks. In a cross-site scripting attack, an attacker finds a vulnerability, in this case a reflected cross-site scripting attack, in some vulnerable website, in this case vuln.com. To attack his victim, he sends the victim a link. This could, for example, be via email or embedded in an iframe on some page, for example, showing cat pictures, because these are always nice to look at. And so then the victim's browser will download this resource, will make the request towards vuln.com, get the HTTP response back, and then in the response, there is all of a sudden now this red snippet, namely the script source evil.com, which will then, the browser would then download essentially from evil.com, getting now the evil JavaScript. So this is a classic case of a cross-site scripting vulnerability where an attacker is able to inject their own code into a vulnerable application. And so now here comes CSP to the rescue, because CSP allows a web developer, a first-party web developer, to say, I explicitly instruct the client to not download any content from other resources than those that I have explicitly whitelisted. So that's the entire idea of CSP, to ensure that you whitelist where code can be loaded from, as well as other resources. So this seems like a nice idea to mitigate content injection vulnerabilities. However, let's have a look at the evolution of CSP to understand why maybe some of those people that have struggled in the past actually did struggle. So looking back at 2012, when the first version of CSP level 1 came out, let's assume that we have this particular type of snippet here, okay? So I have an HTML document with the body where I have some script that is loaded from ad.com, some ad.js. And looking at the script, we already figured out that ad.com includes additional scripting resources from company.com, okay? So for example, if this is actually an ad company, they would typically, based on the ad that they show you, they would add additional script resources from, let's say, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, or Audi. Plus, we have another script here, which is what we call an inline script. So we have a script tag where we have the code inside, okay? And so if we wanted to have a CSP that is attempting to secure this page, while at the same time not breaking the functionality, we would simply have to do the following. We would have to set a script source, whitelist explicitly ad.com, right? This could even be some ad.js if we want to be more specific. Whitelist company.com, and then have this dreaded keyword called unsafe inline. The reason for this is that in its first version, CSP did not allow for inline scripts. Okay, so now the problem is using this unsafe keyword, an attacker can still mount a cross-site scripting attack by simply injecting an inline script rather than a script that is hosted on their site. So people understood this and figured out, okay, so all the policies that we see in the wild, they essentially all have the unsafe inline keyword, or they break the sites. So then the proposal level 2 was to add the concept of nonces and hashes. I will briefly only talk about nonces. Hashes work essentially by explicitly hashing the content of a file that is then whitelisted. So it works as follows. With a nonce, I can now attach this nonce to this inline script, meaning that I explicitly say, okay, this is a script that is coming from the developer. This nonce is supposed to be random, meaning that every time an attacker would try to inject some script content here, he'd have to guess the nonce. This is sufficiently random, so there's no way that this can be guessed. So the web browser can make a decision. This script that has the correct nonce, I will execute. The other script that does not have the correct nonce, I will just refuse to execute. Okay, and so you can also attach this to other scripts. So in this case, we see that the nonce is attached to a script from ad.com. And you see up here that for script source, we don't have to explicitly whitelist ad.com anymore because their script is nonced as well. What we do have to do, however, is still whitelist company.com because we simply, we would have to ask ad.com to kind of propagate this nonce, but they won't change their code, right? It's an ad company that is not the first party. So we need to understand what are the inclusions that are done by ad.com. And here comes another problem, especially in the example of advertisements. As I said before, there might be an ad shown depending on your interest. Okay, so there's real-time bidding going on. So that means that when the page is loaded, the web developer can't necessarily know which additional script content will be loaded. This might be Mercedes.com, Audi.com, or BMW.com. And to mitigate this problem, in 2016, the latest version, level 3 of CSP, introduced the concept which is called strict dynamic. And strict dynamic essentially is the idea that you have a script that is trusted, either by being nonced or having a hash that is completely whitelisted, that can then programmatically create additional scripts. Okay, so in this case, we see here, we have a nonce, and then we have inside this script island here, with a document create element, we set script source ad.js and append this to the document. And assuming that the ad.js from ad.com does the same when adding additional scripts, we now don't have to carry like a whitelist anymore, but we just say, okay, this script is nonced and it's trusted to programmatically add additional scripts. All right, so that much for the history of CSP and how it has evolved with respect to attempting to secure sites against cross-site scripting while not breaking functionality, as you could see in the first example here. So if you paid close attention earlier, you will have noticed that I was talking about a historical analysis from 2012 to 2018. So now you might wonder, were they kind of that clever about 8 years ago to start collecting data such that they can then write a paper at some point? And the answer is obviously no. There is actually a nice way of still going back in time. And it's called the Internet Archive. And so the Internet Archive has been archiving web applications or websites since, I guess, 1996. And it's nice in that sense that they don't only record the content that is shown on the web pages themselves, but also they record all the original headers that were used way back when. Okay, and so if you go to the archive and open, for example, your developer toolbar, you'll notice that there are a lot of headers which are called xarchive oric and then dash something. Okay, so that means that all the original headers were persisted and can be retrieved. So what we essentially did is we selected this 10,000 list of sites, or this 10,000 sites, sorry, and then essentially for those sites looked at all the snapshots from 2012 to 2018 and extracted the CSPs from the header in this case. So now you might wonder, okay, so what are the results of this study? Because the assumption would be, well, it's a security mechanism, it takes a bit of time. We've seen these improvements in different levels to make it more useful in practice. So you'd expect that CSP adoption over time will rise and that the new features are also kind of picked up quickly. And your intuition would be correct. Okay, so this is the graph showing our high-level results. So here's the end of 2018. So about 11% or so of all the websites that we checked at that point had some CSP that was being deployed. Okay, and down here you see the adoption of the different levels. So we categorize this based on the features that they use. So for example, if a policy makes use of nonces but not strict dynamic, we say it's a level 2 policy. If it makes use of none of those things, it's a level 1 policy. And so what we can see here is that the green line, the level 1 line, right, is the lowest one. So it seems like the original features are not sufficient to actually run websites. And on the flip side, we see that since the introduction of level 3 in around 2016, we see a strong increase. And now this is the most widely used level of CSP. So this would somehow imply maybe that under the assumption that this is all related to script content restriction, actually the things that were proposed for CSP really worked and people are now much more secure in hosting their websites. However, I'd like to actually let Sebastian explain a little bit more about the use cases that we've seen for CSP.
Okay, as you can see, as Ben already mentioned, and as you can see on the red line, the overall adoption of CSP is increasing, which is a good thing. However, its initial use case, the script content control, is only used in around 1/3 of all CSPs in the wild. Naturally, this means that there are other use cases as well, but let's first deep dive into the script content restriction capabilities of CSP. Let's start with talking about things that makes a CSP trivially bypassable. For example, unsafe inline allows the injection of arbitrary inline JavaScript. Whitelisting whole schemata, such as HTTPS, allows scripts to be loaded from basically anywhere. And allowing data URIs in your CSP is basically allowing base64 encoded inline JavaScript in an URI. Notably, we are here not even talking about things like open redirects and JSONP endpoints and such. But those are only things that are trivially insecure, so no one would use them, right? Sadly, those insecure practices are dominating the usage of script content control policies in the wild. So especially the usage of unsafe inline is very high, which is most probably due to inline event handlers being used on that site. And inline event handlers actually require unsafe inline to work properly. But is deploying a CSP really that hard? Let's have a look on some examples here. For example, GitHub. They started their CSP journey in November 2013 with only 5 entries in their script source directive, which were self, 2 analytics, and 2 CDNs. In May 2014, they combined all their JavaScript assets to one CDN, which is under their control. And they removed the analytics company, so the only 2 whitelisted entries were their own CDN and Google Analytics. In October 2014, they then removed Google Analytics, so they only had 1 single entry, which was their own CDN. Notably, GitHub never used any insecure practices throughout their whole CSP journey. However, GitHub does not require any third-party libraries or advertisement in their web application. So let's take a look into another development story of CSP. Airbnb's journey to a secure CSP. They started their CSP journey as it was intended by the developer of CSP with a policy in report-only mode. In that mode, the policy is not enforced, but violations are reported back to the developer. So they started their journey in November 2014 with 17 entries. And then in March 2015, they added the whole HTTPS schemata to their default and script source, while the policy was still in report-only mode. In May 2015, they switched from the report-only mode to the enforcement mode, while HTTPS, so the whole HTTPS schemata was still one of the whitelisted entries. Then, more than 2 years and 222 changes later, their whitelist has grown, while the HTTPS schemata is still one of the whitelisted entries. But at that point in time, they started experimenting with a secure CSP in report-only mode on single days. So over the course of time, they added more and more domains to that policy, and also from time to time removed some. And in January 2018, they then tried to enforce this new and secure policy. But after less than 1 day, they added the HTTPS schemata again, probably due to some fatal errors that occurred in their web application. Finally, in March 2018, they had a second try for their secure policy. And here they finally managed to deploy a secure and working policy. So as most of you know, Airbnb's main business is their web presence, and it is a big company, but still they needed more than 3.5 years to deploy a secure CSP. So what did we learn about CSP's initial use case? Well, most CSPs in the wild do not effectively protect against cross-site scripting. In fact, insecure practices are dominating the usage of the script source directive. In our examples, we have seen that building a secure policy is very hard and requires massive amount of time and engineering effort, at least for most sites, because most of the websites in the wild rely on third-party assets to work properly. So, as already hinted at, there are more use cases of CSP besides the restriction of script content. For example, enforcing secure network connections. I think we all agree that HTTPS should be used everywhere throughout the web, and that we should enforce those secure network connections. And CSP is capable of doing so. In fact, the usage of CSP as TLS enforcement mechanism even surpasses the script content restriction capability of CSP in August 2018. But how can we enforce TLS connections via CSP? Well, in the old days of CSP level 1 and 2, you had to use default source with whitelisted HTTPS schemata, such that, well, every URL, every resource that you try to load over HTTP is blocked by the CSP. Nowadays, so since CSP level 3, there are 2 new directives, which, as the name suggests, blocks all HTTP requests, which might, however, break your application because necessary assets are not loaded. And second, upgrade insecure requests, which upgrades all HTTP requests to HTTPS on the fly, which makes it a great utility for migrating from HTTP to HTTPS, because you can let your hard-coded HTTP links in your legacy application. So, because no one wants that their web application breaks, the majority of all TLS enforcing policies are using upgrade insecure requests. upgrade insecure requests might actually be one of the reasons why the HTTPS adoption in general is increasing throughout the last years. In addition, this graph also shows us that the rise of CSP level 3 is not because more and more policies use the strict dynamic keyword in their script source, but because more and more policies are using upgrade insecure requests. We also further investigated this process of using upgrade insecure requests for TLS migration. And we have seen many of those cases where it indeed was used in a transition from HTTP to HTTPS. For example, Wired.com started deploying HTTPS in June 2016, but they removed their last HTTP resource from their start page only in September 2017. We also tried to investigate the hypothetical impact if all current websites would deploy upgrade insecure requests to get rid of their mixed content problems. Therefore, we crawled the Alexa top 10K and found mixed content on nearly half of them. For nearly 90% of those 4,785 sites, all HTTP resources that we found were upgradable. So they would easily get rid of all their mixed content problems, at least for their front pages, by simply deploying upgrade insecure requests in their content security policy. So what did we learn about TLS enforcement? Well, CSP is awesome to use for enforcing secure network connections. It can be done by using a single directive without managing or maintaining any whitelist of source expressions. Also, CSP makes HTTPS migration incredibly easy. Nearly 90% of the sites that have HTTP links on their front pages could upgrade to HTTPS without the necessity to changing their source code by simply deploying upgrade insecure requests. Notably, there is upgrade insecure requests can be used in isolation, so there is no need to restrict any content for your application. Now, let's talk about something different that is highly relevant for the web. Cat pictures. Everyone loves them, right? So everyone wants to see more of them. However, clicking on buttons might be dangerous due to click-checking attacks, where an attacker lures a victim into, for example, tweeting about a nice talk that you've just seen by placing the tweet button in an opaque iframe that overlays the cat button. So as Ben already mentioned in the beginning, we performed a similar talk at OVASP last year. And here we asked the other conference participants a few questions to get a feeling how prevalent click-checking attacks and framing control and such are in the head of security-aware developers. Most of the developers were aware of framing attacks, and also most of them use the XFrame options header as a defense against framing attacks. However, only a few people thought that XFrame options might not be the best option to control their framing, and even fewer are aware that's of the CSP directive that can actually be used to control your framing. Indeed, the XFrame options header has a lot of problems, security and functionality wise. All X headers, XFO was never standardized, so browsers did not implement it consistently, which leads to several security problems, like browsers that only have partial support for the headers, for the header, and also problems like double framing, which I'll get to in a second. In addition to the security problems, XFO also has functionality problems because it can only have a single whitelist entry, but some sites would, of course, like to be frameable by multiple of their partner domains. So, as you can see here, even big browsers like Chrome, Safari, Opera, and such do not support the allow from method of XFrame options. So in the meanwhile, even since Firefox 17, also Firefox does not longer support allow from. The problem here is that they will fail insecurely by basically allowing all framing. Another problem with the double framing is that in old versions of some browsers and also in the Internet Explorer, the origin that is checked against for comparing the allowed framing origin is only the topmost origin. So if an XFO using website frames attacker.com, which again frames the XFO using website, this is allowed because it is only checked against the topmost frame. To fix all those problems, CSP Level 2 introduced a new directive to control framing behavior of a web application, namely CSP frame ancestors. This new framing control feature of CSP Level 2 is used nearly as often as the other two use cases of CSP that we've seen before. But how does CSP frame ancestors actually address the problems that we have seen in case of XFrame options? Well, first of all, CSP Level 2 is a well-defined standard. So frame ancestors is consistently implemented, which also fixes the problems with partial support of some browsers, because basically all modern browsers that support CSP also support frame ancestors. However, legacy browsers like, for example, the Internet Explorer do not support CSP Level 2, so they also do not support frame ancestors. Also, double framing is fixed by the standard because, according to the standard, frame ancestors applies to, well, all of the frame's ancestors instead of only the topmost frame. But not only the security issues are fixed, also the usability issue is fixed. Just as other CSP directives, frame ancestors supports wildcards and multiple source expressions. And notably, just as in case of upgrade insecure requests, frame ancestors can be used in isolation, so without the need of restricting any content of the web application. Now Ben will have a look together with you on how framing control should be used in practice.
All right, so thank you, Sebastian. So as we've seen, there has been this non-standardized header in the form of XFrame options, and now there is a standardized variant, which is called the CSP frame ancestors. And so let's briefly talk about the best practices. As Sebastian already mentioned now, not all browsers support both mechanisms. Okay? So essentially, when a CSP Level 2 compliant browser observes an XFrame options header and at the same time observes the frame ancestors, it will just ignore XFO. Okay, so that means that if the browser supports frame ancestors, you can safely send an XFO header that is entire garbage because it will be ignored. Okay. So, but what that also means is that if you want to have a website that is secure also for legacy browsers, such as Internet Explorer, that does not support frame ancestors, you'd want to have essentially a secure policy for the legacy browsers and then a maybe a little bit more flexible one for the newer versions. And in particular, this can be achieved by combining two headers, namely setting XFO to deny, which is also the same across all browsers, just means do not allow framing, and then set frame ancestors to self. Okay, so in this case, obviously, self could be also a whitelist of partner domains. That means that your site will be framed by browsers that support Level 2, which essentially are virtually all of them. And just for legacy browsers like Internet Explorer, it will just fail securely and not insecurely in this case. So with this knowledge, and the fact that this has been around for a while, right? We talked about the fact that level 2 has been introduced in 2014. Essentially, we set out to investigate, so how many sites on the web make use of XFO and how many sites make use of frame ancestors. Because as Sebastian mentioned before, you can use frame ancestors in isolation to achieve essentially at least the same level of protection as XFO. And so this graph actually gives us the answer to this, and the answer is unfortunately pretty sad. So first off, what we see here is that in around 2012, XFO was deprecated. This was because simply browsers implemented it differently, and while there is a standard that exists, so there is an RFC, primarily this RFC says this is implemented differently across different browsers. What we do see, however, is that this red line is really taking off, right? So that is by the end of our experiment, at the end of 2018, there was about 1 in 3 websites that were deploying XFO to protect against framing attacks. At the same time, we see that overall, the green line here, which is the usage of CSP frame ancestors, is minuscule, right? So we have about 450 sites or so that made use of it by the end of our analysis period. And even less so did the thing that is necessary to be secure also for backwards, for legacy browsers and backwards compatible. So that is the combination of XFO and frame ancestors. And so we were wondering, like, okay, so why is this? So people are using a mechanism that is insecure, or at least not very flexible, even though there exists a mechanism that is more secure and much more flexible than XFO. And so what we did is we set out to notify developers of these websites about this problem. And in particular, we took those domains that essentially were running XFO, okay, but not running CSP frame ancestors. So essentially the difference between the 2 lines that we saw on the previous slide. So this yielded about 2,700 websites that when we did this experiment were using XFO, but not frame ancestors. And so since I've been doing notifications for security issues for a while, I figured, okay, so we'll send a couple of emails, but the response rate will be really not a lot of people that will be responding to us, okay? So I said, Sebastian, you know what? I'll just take my own email account and I will send those emails from my personal account. And then the 3 emails that come back, I can simply answer. Turns out I was off a bit. So overall, we actually received 117 responses that went beyond automated answers. So for example, yes, we've opened a ticket for you. It has to be said, I sent an email to essentially security at that particular domain.com to see what is coming back. Okay. So looking in particular into those 117 responses that we got, more than half of them said, yeah, sure, we will deploy frame ancestors soon. Frankly, I haven't checked back now, but I doubt that all 62 of them have now deployed CSP frame ancestors. 24 operators responded to us and said, you know what, CSP, that already kind of, I get a ringing in my ears, there's an alarm going off, this is way too complex, this will break my website, okay? And 13 of them explicitly said they had never heard of frame ancestors before we notified them about this. And this is, we didn't really ask them questions so much, we told them this is a problem. And we asked a very generic questions like, is there any reason for why you're choosing this deployment? So we figured, okay, maybe this already gives us some indication of the lack of understanding of people, but let's actually do kind of a bit of a further analysis and read further through these emails and then also do a survey. And I want to highlight a couple of things that were repetitive themes in the emails that we received based on single examples. So the first one is this one. Misconceptions about CSP. And essentially, this says complex beast. CSP is a complex beast. And we've heard this term that CSP is so complex a lot of times. And I wholeheartedly agree when it comes to all the different abilities of restricting content, be it for scripts, be it for images, be it where your JavaScript can make XML HTTP requests towards. Okay, so there's a lot of configuration options, but at least for framing control and TLS enforcement, as Sebastian told you just now, it's really that simple and straightforward and can be used in isolation. And so what we see here is exactly the scenario that Sebastian mentioned before, right? So this person said that they had partner sites that frame their site, and they had run into problems with the XFrame options header, which is exactly what we told you before, because it's inflexible, because it only supports exactly at most one whitelisted origin, and this allow from directive isn't even widely supported anymore. Okay, so clearly a misconception about what CSP can do over what XFrame options can do. The second type of response that we got is CSP destroys web applications. And so this is also in line with essentially the feedback that we got from people when we did the talk in Amsterdam, that they experimented with CSP and that CSP caused some type of breakage. Okay, as I showed you in the very beginning, you have to, for example, if you want to deploy CSP level 1, you have to remove all your inline scripts. The thing that I didn't tell you is you also have to remove all your event handlers, and even in level 3, there's no way of safely whitelisting event handlers. Okay, so you will, as long as you have an event handler on your website, you will break your application if you deploy CSP with a script source or a default source. And this is a repetitive theme that again came up. And in this case, you can see that it was dramatic, saying ended up effectively killing the website. And for many companies, this is their living, so they will obviously then kind of abdicate from CSP. Then again, this term of complexity, CSP is too complex to deploy. So a lot of people complained about first and third party integrations. Remember what I was talking about in the very beginning. You have your ad company that then adds additional resources from BMW.com or Audi.com. And it's super hard for the first party developer to anticipate which will these hosts be. Okay, and then whenever the ad company changes something, this means you have to change your website's CSP again, potentially in the meantime breaking your revenue stream. Okay, and again, nobody can afford to do this. And in particular, what people also said, and this is just one example, is that it's very hard to find this trade-off between not breaking your website and actually adding meaningful security. Because as we saw in what Sebastian was presenting, a lot of the sites that made use of CSP for content restriction, in particular script content restriction, they used the unsafe inline keyword. And this adds zero security. And even though they had like gigantically long lists of explicitly whitelisted hosts, they then added unsafe inline, which essentially breaks the entire security, whereas removing it would break the functionality of CSP. And finally, CSP development and building it takes massive efforts. And what is perceived by developers is that by adding CSP, they add a certain level of security. Okay, but in many scenarios, there are so many other tasks that take fewer time and that actually adds maybe some revenue. Okay, so maybe you build a cool new feature rather than deploying CSP because the cool new feature gets you more users and more paying customers. But this is something that I think everybody who has been working in security at some point understands, that security is often a cost factor, and CSP, with its complexity with respect to content restriction, is oftentimes essentially under the bar of the things that really need to be done. At least that's what we got from our responses here. As I said, apart from these very unstructured emails, because we got a lot of those back, we then decided to say, let's actually do a survey and try to ask specific questions so we can just kind of get numerical values rather than trying to interpret what people told us in their emails. And so the first thing that we asked them in the survey is, why have you implemented XFO? Okay, and you can see here that for most participants, they say this is their own decision. Some of them also talked about certain websites that tell you which HTTP headers to deploy, and that they mentioned you should be using XFO to protect against framing attacks. So this is one side of the medal. What I think is more relevant in this graph, however, is if you look at pen test consultants or tools we use. So it turns out that almost half of the pages of the people that answered to our survey here, they then said that essentially things that they pay money for, so be it pen testers or be it tools, tells them to use this particular header and not the other one. Okay, so essentially, if pen testers or consultants as well as these tools would propose to use maybe both, right, XFO and CSP frame assistance, as we discussed as the best practice before, we'd actually see a totally different landscape here, which would allow websites to leverage the kind of increased flexibility of CSP over XFO. Then we more specifically, because we had been now in contact with these people, be it from the framing control angle, we asked them a little bit further about CSP and their capabilities and what they think about CSP. And so the question that we asked then is, do you believe CSP is a viable option to improve your site's resilience against cross-site scripting attacks? And essentially, all of them said yes, except for, well, maybe one person who didn't know, and one person who said, no, this is not going to change at all. And so then the next question obviously said, okay, cool, there's this mechanism that you think will help you and it's going to be great. Do you think you can deploy it? So the next question was, would this work out of the box without breaking anything and essentially using any of the unsafe keywords. And here we see one side operator said yes, and essentially the rest said no, or I don't know, because simply they don't know, and they cannot assess this even, because many of these things actually come from third parties that introduce additional scripts or that make use of insecure practices. So overall, it seems like CSP for content restriction or restricting scripts is extremely hard. And well, essentially, as the title tells us, the answers that we got when we notified people about using CSP for a single use case, which can be done in isolation, they told us this is too complex. I cannot deal with this. I heard about CSP and it will break my website. But all these things are not related to framing control. These things are all related to the fact that people tried script source or default source, it broke some stuff, and now they have in their mind an image of CSP as this security mechanism that will just break your website. All right, so takeaway messages. CSP for script content is often too complex in practice. This is not even to be blamed on CSP, but this is, I think, rather to be blamed on the very complex nature of applications on the web these days, where essentially CSP is not necessarily the right mechanism unless all parties that contribute to a website will actually kind of follow this particular standard. We have seen that CSP is extremely useful and easy to use for TLS enforcement and framing control, right? Remember, upgrade insecure requests and you don't have HTTP anymore on your website. Frame ancestors self and you don't have click checking anymore. Okay, so it's really that simple as we discussed here. And we saw that the misconceptions about CSP and the unusable content control mechanisms, that is script source, and I'm saying unusable in the sense of it just doesn't fit what current websites are made of, seems to block the easy to use CSP features and just leaves in people's minds that, well, it's restricting the scripts that is to blame, that CSP has a bad name, is not being used. With this, we'd like to thank you for taking a look at this video. Typically, we would have really liked to interact with everybody that is in the audience. If you have seen talks from me, I really like to involve the audience and get to know who's in front of me and learn something from them. And in particular, in this talk, we would have really liked to hear about your experiences with CSP and what you have maybe faced, what type of problems you have maybe faced. We are still really happy to hear this feedback. So if you want to, feel free to send us an email and just tell us your war stories about how CSP did not work for your company. So maybe we can all learn something from this and actually improve maybe CSP or improve maybe tools to actually make websites or make the website's job easier to deploy CSP. All right, that's from our side. Thank you and hope to see you in 2021 in Bochum in person.